So Andy is a good friend of mine and a good friend of many here today, and also a relative of some here today. So Louis, his son, who did the creative part in our film we've just seen. He's employed by the Church of England as the Social Responsibility Officer for Hull and East Riding, and has done that job for over 30 years now. He's lived in Hull virtually all his adult life and has lived on North Brownstone for 25 years with his family. He thinks his life and work have something to do with working out, with the help of many others, and a holistic understanding of this place, its people, and what to do with and about all of that. So, Andy, over to you.
Okay, well, I don't all this talk about triggering and safety. I mean, I don't know. We go in the film, and if I, it's a bit different on Zoom, isn't it? I'm not in a room with you, and I may be quite small, so you might not see what's going on with me. But if I go quiet, I'm just trying to control myself. So, hello, yeah. So it's all about love, but your loving happens in time and space. Yeah. So I'm going to start with some stuff about Hull and its recent history in terms of the scale of some of the difficulties that we face and their costs. I'm aware, as we understood from the bits of information collected by Susie as people registered, that a proportion of you aren't from Hull. But my brief is, what is the cost of ACEs to Hull? And so what are we dealing with and what can we do about this? And to make connections. So hopefully, if you aren't from Hull, you will make some connections to where you are. So the Hull Children's Safeguarding Board, in its annual reports around the mid-2010s, used the term toxic trio. When any child came into care, there was a very good chance the home life was characterised by alcohol and/or drug addiction, mental health problems, and domestic violence. That's the toxic trio. Hull has been at or near the top of the league table for children in care for years. Ofsted were coming in 2018 when the number was 800. There was a new director of children's services in 2017. The head of childcare was ousted as a sacrificial lamb, and the not quite so new director in 2018 was sacked because Ofsted saw through it. And the number of children in care now approaches 1,000. We have a chronic, endemic, persistent problem with children that parents can't cope with because, in my opinion, they are themselves very often the products of a system that bequeaths to them through addictions, mental health distress, and violence, and whatever else, the inability to attach to, play with, nurture, discipline consistently, support the learning of, and bring to adulthood in something like a fit state their own young. And that's no matter how desperately they want to. And believe me, most are desperate to do that for their kids. Pause was a great idea. It took a government-funded special initiative to provide funding to create a unit, a multidisciplinary team, to support a group of women who looked like they were going to go on having children, no matter how many were removed from them, because no one ever addressed their trauma. No one ever listened to them. Quoting from a report to the Early Support and Lifelong Learning Scrutiny Commission of Hull City Council, in August 2014, an initial brief analysis was undertaken of siblings taken into care in the previous 5 years as part of the information requested for the pause application to the Department for Education. A total of 217 mothers were identified. This showed that 48 mothers accounted for 129 children 48 mothers accounted for 129 children in care. These range from having just 2 children taken into care, 26 mothers, to 5 of their children being removed, 2 mothers. Of the children still in care, none have rehabilitation plans. Those 129 children represented about 20% of all the children in care. The pilot began in 2015 for 3 years, and I believe Hull managed to keep the pilot going for an additional 2 years. It appeared to have been highly successful, with multiple huge benefits for the women concerned. The number of children in care has risen from under 300 in 2004 to 640 in 2011, plus another 245 on child protection plans, staying at home, to 799 in care and 543 on protection plans in 2019. The number of children in care is now about 950. An agency foster placement costs £40,000 per annum. Hull City Council pays its foster carers about £200 per child. The scale varies above or below that according to age. That's 10k per child. Increasingly, large proportions of a rapidly diminishing budget have been spent on a rising number of children, which still only represents a small proportion of under 17s in Hull. But 2% of children is a very significant proportion, and many would say does not reflect the actual need, if one needs to be in care. Hull is in receipt of less than 55% of the central government funds it received when funding cuts kicked in 2010. It has less than half of the money it had to spend than it did in 2010. This year, the Children's Services budget of 60 million will account for 24%, nearly a quarter, of the council's whole budget. And this includes an additional 7.4 million this year above last year. Adult social care will take 36% share of the council's budget this year. Alongside the huge government cuts and increased adult social care costs, the extra 2% you pay on your council tax doesn't begin to cover it. Means that there is a lot less money for other services. Youth service cuts are an obvious example of why robbing Peter to pay Paul is just an idiotic move. I found it impossible to detail the extent of council cuts to youth services here in Hull, but the National Youth Agency reported in November 2020 that the left unprotected by government, youth services have already been cut by over 70% in less than a decade. i.e. since 2010. I believe that cut in Hull has been much more significant than that. And the money which is left is now more focused on targeted support, including targets for one-to-one work with identified children with issues. So any ordinary kid. The withdrawal of support for community organisations, community centres, area offices for council and housing services, cuts in hours of libraries, less parkies around the place, they all have an effect. We might call these pro-social services that might provide the bits and pieces of support, connection, escape, pleasure for children, but also their carers. They've all been cut significantly, or in some cases completely. We have all heard about cuts in drug and alcohol services and mental health services, although that's also a problem with staff recruitment, with teams half empty. The only one of the toxic trio that maintains levels of funding is domestic violence. But there, the need is rising too. I know very little about the police, so I'm not going to say anything about that. I do know that in 2015, the National Association of Head Teachers published their annual report, and the papers picked up the phrase, schools becoming mini welfare states. The Local Government Information Unit daily news briefing of the 1st of May 2015 under that heading said, schools are being forced to act as miniature welfare states to plug the gaps created by cuts in services to the poorest families. A survey of more than 2,000 head teachers found that they were having to buy clothing such as uniforms and even underwear for their pupils, as well as providing washing facilities and breakfasts. The survey by the NAHT estimates that schools are spending £43 million a year to offset the effects of poverty on their pupils. And we're at, excuse me. And we are talking about soothing children into a day who arrive in states of distress. We're talking about calming parents too, and trying to get them the help they need. And that's aside from all the stuff that kicks off when obvious or likely harm gets to a level when the school has to call children's services. Whole stats on domestic violence, addictions, levels of mental health, self-referrals, long-term unemployment, and stress generated by low incomes, or in my opinion, particularly indebtedness, all point to likely high prevalence of some ACEs in Hull. COVID may have accelerated the trajectory, but Hull already had an ocean of need, an ocean of ACEs. That is a high prevalence for disproportionately large numbers of children. And I think that goes for a pretty high proportion of parents and not a few grandparents. I can't prove that, but I'd stake my life on it. Now I want to fill out that, hopefully that wasn't all just stats, but I want to fill that out a bit. Here are some rather more anecdotal things, perhaps, or reflections, if you like. I have a very well-travelled friend from the USA. He's pretty well versed in trauma personally and works with traumatised people, though that's not his specialism. Anyway, he can read the faces and the bodies and the tones. He spent a lot of time on the bus and walking the city in his several visits to Hull, where he stayed for a while. He said to me last year that Hull was the most traumatised place he'd ever been. I'm thinking and talking and working out some micro interventions with a small group of friends and colleagues from the Christian community in Hull. It arose initially from a colleague's experience in a pastoral role in a secondary school. For many, an absent, dysfunctional, or even just useless and casually aggressive male around is par for the course. My friend saw 1/6 of the population of the school in a year, 2016-17, for some kind of support. Every single one of those children, every single one of them mentioned some kind of what we have come to call fatherlessness, for want of a term. Fatherlessness. Rarely was it the cause of the acute problem, just an ongoing one. Maybe they were only the only ones? No chance. That 1/6 probably represents nearly 6/6. And this school is in a difficult area, but not dissimilar to the whole of the rest of the Hull when compared to the rest of England. The most relevant ACE definition is abandonment, or loss of a biological parent. ACEs are a tool. Their definition and the use of the assessment is not meant to tell the whole story of a life and to pick up all the nuances. Not having a parent there for you is a loss and can be traumatic, and that trauma will take its toll. We think this may be a fact of life for a very, very large proportion of children in Hull. Many children, most of the time, manage amazingly well in spite of this and other traumatizing experiences, but it takes its toll. This is one of the now endemic epidemics we choose to ignore. My own direct experience since working for what I used to call the SS, social services, childcare. You've heard my direct experience implied in 2 stories from the whole film, actually. I know, not as a professional, but as a friend, a couple of dozen whole people really well. Some of them from back when I was in the SS. I'd say the average ACEs score would be 6, although some would only be 1. I can point to situation after situation where an unresolved trauma, compounded by a few other softer ones, have resulted in a replication of problems down the line with their children. These are people for whom I have great admiration. The famous Chumbawamba song seems most appropriate. Susie thought you might not remember it, so it's I get knocked down, but I get up again. And again, and again, and again. Also, I feel the need to say something about blame and shame. Tony Blair's league tables on everything made it clear to the world that Hull was just a plain bad place. Anyone with money left, and the population fell by 7% in the few years before the last millennium ended. The very late 90s up to 2000. In my experience, Hull people don't need much help in feeling bad about themselves. Whatever bravado you may encounter should you imply that to someone. By 2003, it was Hull people who voted Hull the first Cracktown winner. And this is where you get in trouble if someone wants to edit you unfairly. I need to stay focused, and there's much more I could say about this, of course. But we do know, don't we, that we can't blame the kids. But we do blame and shame those kids who become parents themselves, who find doing a good job of it so very, very hard. So we are in effect blaming kids. In terms of dealing with trauma, many are still in effect traumatized children. Rather than blame, we need to ask, what are the roots of the problem? Where does responsibility lie? What keeps the problems recurring and multiplying, and what can we do about it? Well, there's a whole day and the rest of your life to go on working that out, and I hope you will, because I will. I'll try to say some things about why we have to face this issue here and this city as soon as possible. Now I want to make some suggestions, last part, promise. Now I want to make some suggestions about why here and about how we understand this aced place. I've been a student here, then I worked in the child and adolescent psychiatric unit, West End, as it used to be called, at Broadgate Hospital for 3 times 3 months auxiliary nurse contracts, starting 2 weeks after my 16-year-old brother had killed himself. So they probably saved me 2. And then I came back to do a CQSW, social work qualification. So having been a residential social worker, last job in a short career, processing 104 children through a 3-bedded emergency reception care into unit in a 9-month period, mainly trying to get them back home after a bust up of some sort. Then working in a newly opened hostel for a year and seeing a fair few care leavers and any number who might have been passed through. I started working for the Church of England as the thing I was introduced as. I worked with churches whose leaders described the most damaged people they'd yet encountered in their vicar lives, and who described recurring problems, be they individual, familial, whatever that was, and local community, or a mixture. And no matter how hard you and your predecessors tried and prayed, issues kept recurring. So my question was, why is Hull like this? That was 30 years ago. The next 20 years, reasonably consistently, I worked with a changing group of church-related workers and vicars, etc., on that question. Or to restate what I said before, what are the roots of the problems? Why do they keep recurring and multiplying? What do we do about it? I tried to bring my economics and my politics and my sociology together with more personal and psychological and socio-psychological and spiritual approaches, along with those other people to bear on this. So a quick canter now through some colloquialized and again very generalized part answers. Part 1. Hull was not well parented. Offering some merchants a license to start a port away from the influence of previous authorities, that is church ones, so that maybe that was a good thing, because the king wants a quicker way of getting armaments to fight a war in Scotland, that's not a good start for a place. There was never enough fresh water for a rapidly growing place, so the enmity with the East Riding goes a very, very, very long way back. Essentially, Hull remained isolated no matter how much it grew. We all know what isolation can do to a thing. And it was always going to be the product of flatness. You think about the language, the intonation, the views and horizons, or the lack of them. Then there were the core industries. Fishing is as dangerous as it gets, far more life-threatening than mining or basically just about anything else. And you don't get your bodies back. You don't even know where or when they died for most of that history. There's no closure, just constant remembering. The docks were not much better, and the dock labour scheme didn't last long. Dockers may have been an elite group at the end, but they are dying now, and their forebears turned up and waited to be picked up at the gates for generations. Hull has always been a low-skill, low-wage economy. The amount of surplus profit in most of what it does has always been low. Hull has a tenth of the Victorian philanthropist, rich local industrialist, finance municipal buildings that Bradford has. We all know what state Bradford's in now. No reason to learn here. No work requires it. No contact with anywhere else. No way of getting out. Precious little trade union organising. Compare it to the solidarity of a pit village or a shipbuilding or a smelting community. In the end, it had to be women who occupied the trawlers. Democracy didn't arrive in Hull until 1835 with the reform of the corporation, the local business group. There's been a culture of control by the corporation, which wasn't broken then and still, I'd argue, persists. Home stretch. What really dealt the hammer blows that mark Hull's modern era out from the crowd are, in our opinion, the triple whammy of the destruction of World War II, the decanting of large sections of historic communities to new outer estates, and the sudden and total loss of the fishing industry and 20,000 jobs. And, frankly, with it, a reason to be here. Oh, and the docks got containerised, of course. You saw all that in the £3 million light show on January the 1st, 2nd and 3rd, 2017 at the beginning of the Year of Culture. Somewhere in here, maybe the roots of high levels of domestic violence and some of our other issues dig in. When Middlesbrough hit the top of the index of multiple deprivation charts a few years earlier in the 2010s, shooting up the table thanks to Thatcher's decimation of manufacturing industry and finally maxing out as anyone without left for Ingleby Barrack, its redundant workers were much, much more highly educated and trained and collective action savvy than Hull workers ever were. And they've been earning much, much more as a result. For Middlesbrough, hitting the top was the result of a terrible shock. For Hull, it has been business as usual for hundreds of years. To conclude, and without using the F word, which is the one I think that is most appropriate, but I'll say screw instead or screwed instead. So why might ACEs be a feature of life in Hull? In summary, because you can screw some of the people some of the time, and not traumatize a whole population. If you screw enough of the people for long enough, you bet your life you'll traumatize nearly everyone. Some people would call it capitalism, exacerbated by globalism, etc., etc., etc. And I'd agree, except you have to come to terms with this particular place as well as your own trauma. If you're going to live here well, or getting weller, and if you work here as an incomer or an aspirant, you too must come to terms with here, this place, so as not just to extract a good lifestyle from the poverty industry, welfare, stay in your state, but rather forget professionalism and detachment and distance, and see people, hear people, feel people, get face to face, and respond, or try and respond as the fellow traveller that you are. The end.
Thank you, Andy. That's amazing. I'm just going to put myself beside you. There we go. Brilliant. Amazing. Jenna put, wow, we need more people with Andy's level of compassion and passion. And I think that's why you were the perfect person to deliver our keynote this morning. I love that closing statement. Rather forget professionalism and detachment and distance, and see people, hear people, feel people, get face to face and respond as the fellow traveller you are. I think that's sometimes is the issue when, you know, when the services get involved, you become a project rather than a person. And you know, I hope that that will be an amazing, you know, hope for the future. But I think it's something we're going to have to keep talking about and keep poking people and keep raising this and raising this. Otherwise, you know, this behemoth that's moving forward at an incredible pace is not going to be moved. I don't know whether any of you were listening to radio yesterday. I was on Burnsley show talking about this event. Amanda had been interviewed a few days before and talked very eloquently about her story, and then Burnsley interviewed me live yesterday, and he had heard that our rates for children in care had broken all records, and we were outstripping everybody else's statistics. And he just wanted us to start thinking about controlling that, that, you know, maybe putting a stop to these women who were repeatedly having children who were being taken away from them. Just we had to intervene and stop them having babies. And he was actually later on in the conversation talking about sterilisation. So, you know, I wonder how you'd respond to that, Andy.
Well,
what you would have said if you've been
one of the things that didn't get in the biog and why I had access to two of those bits and pieces is because I was a counsellor for 7 years through the worst period of austerity, the worst period of the cuts, it now turns out. But and one of the most shocking things that I heard from a bloke called John Plant, who was the director of the Children's Services bit, was the description of multiple women who were just allowed to go on having children without anybody making any serious attempt to ask them why. What's happening to you? You know we're going to turn up and we're going to take the next one away. And actually he said that the maximum number had got up to 7 now. That may not quite be supported by the facts, but it really, really upset me that there wasn't enough humanity in the system to anybody to ask the women concerned what was going on for them. That's tragic. So Now, along comes the government and actually some very compassionate social workers from Hackney who designed the pilot, and lo and behold, I mean, yeah, Amanda suggested some of the sorts of people around that helped her. You put together a group of team whose focus is the women, and yeah, they were on long-acting contraceptives. So, but you only went on the program if you were prepared to go on a long-acting contraceptive. But the upside was you'd have a youth worker and a counsellor and a drugs worker and a mental health worker and anything else you needed to focus on you. Yeah, to focus on the women. And it was only 26, I think, in the pilot group to help them. And what a surprise. Astoundingly, it worked. Not because of the long-term acting thing, but there were huge improvements in people's lives. And, so I think Burnsy's been provocative about the sterilisation, but we simply do not need that kind of draconian idiocy. We just need to start listening to people.
Yeah, absolutely.
That is not easy. It took a lot of resources. But the costs, that's why I talked about some of those costs. They are absolutely huge. Stupendous. And, it would repay us many, many, many times over to take a much more caring approach to those traumas as they are evidenced, rather than just, in this instance, taking children into care. Sorry, long answer.
Yeah, no, I think it's spending money on mopping up the damage rather than investing in that intervention early on. It multiplies hugely, doesn't it? Mopping up is much more expensive than intervening. And I think the way
Amanda wants to say something, Susie.
Oh yeah, sorry, Amanda.
I was just going to say, you're totally right. The prevention doesn't cost that much. Yeah, if you let it progress to, like prison, criminal justice service, homelessness, benefits, that ends up costing a fortune. And it's that short-sightedness that we need to overcome, to enable women to have better support at the beginning, before everything turns to shit and your children are taken away. And, just the cost of all those things is massive compared to what it would cost to help, in my example, as a child, it wouldn't have cost that much, but I've literally cost the system a bloody fortune because they didn't give me support in the first place. And then I'm meant to feel guilty about the money that's been spent. So, it's just...
Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, I think a statistic I heard recently was if shifting to early intervention rather than later, I think it's the Wave Trust came up with this, we'd save £20 billion. Yeah. By doing that. But the problem is that early intervention requires political will, doesn't it? This is the problem.
Yes, it does require political will, and that's part of the reason why I gave the emphasis that I gave. I call the thing I used to work for the SS.
Yeah.
I think there are elements of it which behave like that towards people.
Yeah.
I've seen it. I've heard about it with Lee. Now, but it's not because all of those individuals working in that system are bad people.
No.
I have met some bad people in that system, but the vast majority aren't. But it is a system, and all of these elements of it are established elsewhere. The question for me is, how does Hull, understanding itself and its history, which I do think is important in this, how do we get a grip on that? Frankly, I don't think that's likely from our political leadership as a Labour Party member and having tried as a councillor for 7 years. I think the only thing that will change the system here is that if you get a significant enough number of people by this kind of activity, building a community of people who understand this and work together and, in a sense, rise up or influence the system from within, which is why I think this whole ACE awareness thing, it's not perfect. There are nuances that it doesn't pick up, as I suggest, you know, but as a meet an organizing principle to get people behind, I think it's incredibly important, because I think the system isn't going to change in whole unless there's an upsurge of workers, parents, people who've been through it, working together to try and achieve that. Because I think it's stuck, the system is stuck.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, and I think that's one of the reasons I set up Hey ACEs, is that, you know, around the country and around the world, movements where they have been successful in getting this sort of critical mass of interest and enthusiasm about becoming trauma informed in our approach has happened because of grassroots activism. You know, an individual raising the alarm, getting them the word out there, getting people to film screenings of the Resilience film, which is just an excellent communicator. It's just 1 hour long, and you know, communicates so much in that hour. And then people getting into groups afterwards, sort of professional groups, or so people working in social services, people working in education, people working in the judiciary and the police, people working in just hotels and shops, you know, anybody who works with people